The 2026 Winter Olympics Special. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges, joined by co-host Jake Fulton. Jake, what have you got for us today?
In today's Winter Olympics Special, we will be talking about 13 controversial topics going into this season's Olympics, as again, today is when the opening ceremony is taking place. And so today we are going to do our first debate series that we've ever done, except it's going to be a bit on the informal side. We'll start with our first question. So are you ready, Isaac, for our first informal debate series that we've ever done on the Great World Productions?
Well, I suppose so. We've picked up the pace because we've got 13 whole questions to get through. So I'm ready when you are, my friend.
We certainly do. And then we'll also cover some other interesting facts about this year's Olympics throughout the debate series as well as at the very end. So, the first question we've got here should, and by the way, these are from artificial intelligence that we've taken these questions from, and we haven't necessarily gone through and discussed these questions ahead of time. This is the first time that we have seen this. In fact, we are expecting to do more of these mini debate series in the future, and the same rules will apply. But let's start here with question 1, now that we have all of the rules in store for us. Should the IOC continue awarding the Winter Olympics to countries with shrinking natural snow due to climate change? Isaac, any opinions to kick off our debate series?
Well, Jake, I'll be honest. This question seems a little bit silly and doesn't provide a lot of context. Perhaps it would be important context to have to answer that question. But of course, the IOC being the International Olympic Committee, they're in charge of planning the event. And of course, in this case, determining what countries get to host these different events. And of course, the question here asks these countries that don't get as much snow as what they used to, should they still be in consideration for hosting the Winter Olympics? And the reason that seems like a little bit of a silly question is because obviously many of these events, skiing, snowboarding, what have you, you mentioned, Jake, one of the new events, what was it, ski mountaineering?
Yes, that's one of the new
Yes.
events that we'll see this year's this year's Olympics.
That's one of the new ones. So naturally, a lot of events in the Winter Olympics require snow. So it would make sense that if there's been enough change in these countries that they're not getting snow, that would make it quite difficult. Not sure what the alternative is if they're staying there in spite of a lack of snow, if they're doing artificial snow. That would seem difficult. So I suppose it would make sense to deal with this on a case-by-case basis. Will there be enough snow to justify having the Olympics here or not? At this point, if it's a question, not really sure, again, the context surrounding this, if that's been a huge issue. I'm guessing it hasn't been a huge issue up to this point. This is just a theoretical question down the line. So suppose if these areas stop getting enough snow, naturally they would want to consider moving. But probably we're not quite there, if I had to guess. Jake, any thoughts?
Yeah, I've actually got a couple of different things to say about it. This is actually the third time that Milan has hosted the Winter Olympics. So I would say, at least if we were to coordinate it to this year, I don't necessarily think that that's a really big concern with the lack of snow shortages. The other thing is the mountains are not being as affected by this problem as, let's say, some other regions down in the lower elevations. A lot of people could say here in Missouri that we've had quite a bit of a decrease in the amount of snow. A lot of people say that we had much more snow, like a lot of locals around here said that there was lots more snow back in the 80s, and there is historic records that do back that up. And so we do know that climate change has affected that as the overall global temperature has increased. So this is certainly something that I think should be taken into consideration. That being said, technology has increased, and a lot of ski resorts stay open mainly because natural snow can be produced. Something else that I think is worth mentioning is not all of the Winter Olympic sports occur on snow. That's something else to kind of mention here. But then again, quite a few of them do, and so that has to be taken into account. But I think we should also remember that the Miami Marlins baseball stadium, Major League Baseball stadium, was actually transformed into an ice hockey, like for a national hockey game. There was an NHL game that was played there in Miami, which is a considerably tropical place when you compare it to where a lot of the other ice rinks are across America. And so I think that shows if we're able to naturally make an ice rink, then I feel like we would be able to naturally make snow like we do at the ski resorts, therefore resolving this issue. And so even if there is countries with the shrinking natural snow that is starting to develop, then I think there would be alternative solutions. But I also know that at the Great Lakes, there has been some ice sculpting competitions that have actually been canceled in years past because, well, they've melted before the judges have had a chance to judge them because of warmer climates. But overall, I think a lot of the countries that have been picked in the past with natural snow, I feel like would still have enough snow, at least in the mountain ranges, to where they still would be able to carry it on. So my opinion would be keep it in the same locations that have been chosen in the past, because even though there is quite a significant drop in natural snow, there's been an increase in artificial snow with the newest technology. So I would
Right.
probably say just about the opposite of what you said.
Okay, well, I don't know that that's exactly the opposite from what I said. I might not have been all that clear, and again, that's another point. A great point there, something that I wasn't entirely aware of in terms of though that would explain now that you mention it, the year-round ice skating rinks and different things like that, how they're able to do that. I suppose that isn't necessarily a new thing, and now that you mention it, certainly I've seen snow machines, different things like that, and I certainly would agree with that, keeping this around in the countries where it's initially planned within reason as long as possible. Now, necessarily, of course, there are the cost considerations, the cost of the snow using snow machines or whatever versus the
Right.
cost of just moving, relocating. So naturally, that's something to take in consideration. But realistically, if possible, say it's favorable to stick where they're already at. And at this point, it seems that would make the most sense. Of course, the Winter Olympics that are coming up just this year. Of course, we don't foresee a lot of issues with that coming up in Milan, so probably ought to leave those as is.
Well, and I will say there are a couple of things that I said that there's probably an argument against. One thing is that in Miami, that was an enclosed space. So that was part of the reason why they were able to do that in a
Right.
tropical climate. So that's part of the reason there. Another thing is there is quite a decrease in snow. And the fact is that if it is too warm, even the artificial snow can melt. And so that would be maybe a concern that people would have to consider. But at least at this time, I think I don't necessarily know
Right.
that there's only specific, because I mean, yes, the climate stays just about the same. It changes a little bit. There may be a few warmer climates, of course, the climate may overall be warming, but it
Uh,
still varies from year to year. And so it's really hard to predict that based on what a past year has had.
right. But that said, not a major concern, at least not yet.
Well, that kind of covers the first question. We'll go into the next question here. Is it ethical for Italy to spend billions on Olympic infrastructure while facing economic challenges and public debt? So, I guess I'll go ahead and start the discussion on this question. Well, I have to say that talking about spending billions or spending unnecessary amounts of money, this may be unpopular by opinion to locals around here or people in the regional area, but I happen to disagree with the Kansas City Chiefs building a new stadium from Arrowhead over in Kansas City, Kansas. And one of the reasons that I disagree with that decision, obviously part of it could be the fact that I am, you know, from or am a Missouri Tiger, I guess you could say. But one of the reasons is I feel like it's a waste of money, if I'm going to be completely honest.
Right, right. That certainly would seem to be the case. Of course, we talked about this previously here on the podcast, certainly on GWP News, of course, with the Kansas City Chiefs relocating from, mind you, their historical location, their historic stadium here at Arrowhead in Kansas City, Missouri, over to the dark side, over to the Kansas side. Very unfortunate, huge loss for the state of Missouri. Again, as a friend of mine said, well, there goes the last Missouri NFL team. A very sad day for our state, and that's not great. Of course, that was a big draw for different people coming into the state in terms of the state economy, attending these different games and whatnot. So, unfortunate there. Of course, as we previously mentioned, on that, Missouri does have the historical claim to Kansas City, contrary to what one might expect. Of course, if they heard recently with the Super Bowls, if that's the first time you've heard of the Chiefs and they're the Kansas City Chiefs, you may think, oh, they're the Kansas City Chiefs. They must be in the state of Kansas. Well, no, actually, the city of Kansas City, Missouri, predates the state of Kansas. And so Missouri does have the historical claim to Kansas City and by extension, the Kansas City Chiefs. So just another defense for that sort of on a separate note. And certainly with the way the Chiefs have been performing, it would make sense. It does, I'll have to agree with you, Jake, seem like a bit of that. Not terribly excited about the move, of course, largely being from Missouri here, and certainly my gut tells me also that if it weren't for the Chiefs' decent performance in the past few years, making the past few footballs, Kansas wouldn't even be interested in them. Is that what you've gathered?
That is certainly a possibility. And, would they have rethought this if they would have seen that the Chiefs would have a 6-11 record in 2025, 2026 season? It certainly is possible. And in fact, speaking of the NFL, 2 days from now is going to be the 60th Super Bowl. And so we actually have back to back episodes. Of course, tonight's episode with the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. So we're doing a Winter Olympics special. But tomorrow, we are going to be doing a special over the 60th Super Bowl special episode. And so you can find that tomorrow here on GWP. Brand new episode detailing everything you need to know about the 60th Super Bowl.
Absolutely. So another major sporting event coming up in addition to the Winter Olympics, of course, the 60th Super Bowl, major event here, and something worth noting on that, of course, we know that through the years, of course, NBC now for some time has had the licensing to broadcast the Olympics largely exclusively. However, with major sporting events here, like the Super Bowl, you see they sort of take turns. A lot of the major networks, the big three, NBC, ABC, CBS, thing, maybe sometimes on Fox and your local Fox affiliates for the Super Bowl, and they rotate on that. But interestingly, this year it is NBC's turn to host the Super Bowl, to air it on their network, which happens to be, again, very close in time with the Winter Olympics. So, very interesting. Sort of a busy time for that network, huh?
Yes. In fact, something else that we know, so I'm currently being interrupted by my chiming clock back there. Don't
Yes.
mind that.
Lovely
Um,
chimes.
oh what?
Lovely chimes, yes.
Yes, I'm not quite sure if it comes through, um, if it quite
Didn't
comes
quite
through
come through
the
this time, but I know what you're talking
yes,
about.
yes, yeah. So, um, certainly. And so, but let's go ahead and kind of steer things back into the debate to the original question. So we've got,
Alrighty.
is it ethical for Italy to spend billions on Olympic infrastructure while facing economic challenges? And I guess my thing is, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Is that the saying? If the US is
Yes.
doing it, I
Uh-huh.
feel like that Italy has the right to do it as well. If we're doing
Absolutely.
that with our NFL stadiums. So my answer is it certainly is ethical and should be up to Italy. Is it a smart decision? I don't know. But
Absolutely.
if it is ethical in Italy, or if it isn't, let's say, it shouldn't be ethical here in the United States. And I mean, I will say that the United States is probably arguably better off economically,
Right.
but that's not to say that things couldn't be spent on more useful, more needy type things, we'll say.
Right, naturally, I hadn't thought of the similarity between that and the Chiefs move, Jake. What my mind went to, because this is a national event, of course, involving Italy, was the national debt of the United States, which is a famous
Right.
discussion, of course, on paper, billions of
Yes.
dollars of debt. But naturally, that's something, of course, this coming summer we'll be hosting the Olympic Games. Of course, that's a major thing. So again, here, as you said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and in a certain sense, it makes sense. Obviously, we want to be measured about it in as much as we can. Hasn't exactly been balanced in a long time in terms of the national debt due to a number of different expenses. But in terms of that, sort of cementing our position in the case of the United States as sort of a top world power, having that influence, it would seem that with something as major as hosting the Olympic Games would sort of help in that mission. And I would imagine don't have a lot of context about Italian government and those different things. But I would imagine it would be a similar case there. Certainly, of course, it is up to them, but that would seem to be the case. Jake, any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty well summarized as far as it definitely should be up to Italy. So I guess my opinion on this is it's none of our business. Would be my answer to this question, really, as silly as that may sound. So whether or
Right.
not it should be done or not, I feel like is up to Italy. But I feel like it's none of
Interesting
our
question, but
business.
realistically, not a whole lot we can do about it.
Yes. So, but I think that was interesting to discuss. So, going into the third question, should the Olympics ban countries with ongoing scandals from participating entirely rather than just punishing certain athletes?
Should the Olympics ban countries with ongoing doping scandals from individual athletes? I assume. What exactly is this? Is this referring to drug use or?
I would say that's most likely, and yes, I
Okay.
completely missed that it did say that in there. I actually accidentally
Okay, and
skipped
I'm not
over
sure
that word
exactly. It
here. I'm
seems
just
unusual
paraphrasing it.
because you said these questions were generated by Microsoft Copilot. It seems unusual for it to use slang like that.
Yeah, I would say, we're going to skip this question. Let's go down to the fourth question. That's quite interesting that AI would do that. Is it fair for the
Uh,
2026 games to rely heavily on artificial snow given the environmental impact and water usage? Okay, well, this is interesting. This goes all the way back to question number one. And I think it depends on whether or not you want to make it to where your Winter Olympic Games are in countries that have good enough artificial snow on a yearly basis in order to support the Winter Olympics. What do you think here?
Well, it'd be interesting. Again, don't have a lot of context here on sources of water and different things, but it's not as if we're just taking this water and it's never going to be turned right. Of course, matter can be created nor destroyed. So don't see that. I guess what this is mainly referring to is sort of power source for these snow machines. So whether they're gas powered or electric, and I don't know the question of emissions used to produce the snow. And in terms of that, I'd say if they're doing
Well, I
it on a
think the
large
water
scale,
usage.
um, and generally with the Olympics budget, they're done pretty professionally. Probably, if that's a concern, I'd say that would probably fit easily within the budget to determine an ideal power source for that. Don't foresee that being a major issue. What about you, Jake?
Well, all I have to say is some of that money that Italy is using to build all of this infrastructure, it could be used towards the water for the artificial snow.
Yeah,
Um, that was kind of that was kind of a silly point. That doesn't really that doesn't
absolutely.
necessarily quite a way to look at it. But um, I think one thing that's important to think about is that I feel like that this question could very well, I guess we'll put it this way. You could even say that it's a waste of water when we do all of these events for the 2024 Olympics in these swimming pools that were filled with water instead of
Right.
using natural water in the ocean or in a lake or something.
Right. You could say that, oh, it's a waste of water. We should stop using water for Olympic swimming.
So, I mean, you could make that argument if you're saying that we shouldn't use water to create snow for the Winter Olympics. You could say the
Right.
same thing about the Summer Olympics. Well, we don't necessarily need those swimming pools. We can just
Right.
use the
No.
ocean if we really want to save back on water usage. So I think that's
Really, we
kind
just
of
need to switch to waterless swimming.
that would really hurt, I feel like, especially when it comes to like diving and stuff. So
Uh,
that would be really
just a bit,
painful.
maybe.
Let's dive in a pool with no water. That wouldn't be
Yeah,
good.
or maybe that should just be a new Olympic sport, waterless swimming. That's my petition for the
That
next Olympic sport, waterless
I think it
swimming.
would become who can crawl across the bottom of the pool floor the quickest is what it would become at
Right.
that point.
Yep.
So um, then it becomes a problem because then people would start bleeding because of the hard floor on the bottom of the swimming pool.
Right. Well, then I guess that would give them some liquid, but it might get a bit messy.
Well, and not to mention really, really dangerous for
Yeah. Yeah.
everybody.
Unsanitary. Yeah.
Definitely unsanitary. So, going into the fifth question, should the IOC eliminate judged sports like figure skating due to recurring corruption and scoring controversies? Wow, this is a loaded question.
I would say no. The International
Uh,
Olympic Committee should not eliminate judged sports such as figure skating just because we've had more than a few corruption and scoring controversies in those particular events. I don't know. To my knowledge, the issue of corruption isn't unique to figure skating, though. Tell me if I'm wrong. If you've got an argument that figure skating commentators, people involved in scoring that in the Olympics, specifically for figure skating, are uniquely corrupt, well, we would like to hear that argument. So let us know. Put that in a comment down below the video. That would certainly be an interesting discussion.
yeah, it certainly would be. And my question then is, should we just eliminate any concerns in life when it comes to corruption and scoring controversies? Because if that's the case, every single NFL referee should be fired.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly the NBA. The NBA just doesn't exist anymore after that. I mean,
So,
yeah.
um, So I would say, or at that point, some people could even argue that our government should just disappear at that point because we should just eliminate all of that altogether in order to avoid corruption and scoring controversies and everything. So, kind of a,
Uh,
um, this is another one of those silly questions that we got
yeah,
from AI here. So let's go into the sixth
yeah, it is. So
question
unless you're a
here.
fan of anarchy, maybe don't want to take that one too far.
Yeah. So, sixth question here. Is it appropriate for the Olympics to use venues spread across large distances, increasing travel emissions and logistical complexity?
Okay,
Yes,
interesting question.
is my short answer for this.
Okay, I'd say yes, probably so as well. Okay, is it appropriate for the Olympics to use venues spread across large? Sure, sure. Sometimes that's what's most practical. Of course, the different Olympic events naturally have different requirements in terms of setting. So naturally, and at some point, of course, you're always going to have accommodations for the different events. And
Right.
probably the only alternative I could think of is just eliminating the events. We're not allowed to spread out to have those events at the appropriate locations. So I think it would be much better to
Yeah.
just do things as is, have those events at their appropriate locations, even if they're further apart than what's ideal.
Now, I will say one potential argument that could be potentially against this, or part of the reason why this is being brought up, particularly this Winter Olympics, is because this year is a first. The Winter Olympics are spread out across two major cities. And so some people could argue that that's a waste of, you know, that's just a waste of space. It's unnecessary for two cities. But at the same point in time, I feel like there's an argument on the other side. You're not putting a bunch of strain on one big city. You're spreading it out, which then allows for two cities to handle the stress of hosting such a major worldwide event.
Right. And of course, the Winter Olympics that are coming up, those will be in Italy, as we mentioned, mainly in Milan, but of course, with the different events spaced out, of course, between the different major cities. And an interesting point, Jake, something that comes to mind here, I've often heard people say that if things are much closer together in Europe, so for example, just traveling across, say, to a different state in the United States would be like traveling to another country in Europe. So when you really put this into perspective, they aren't too terribly far apart.
Yes, and so that is something else to consider as well when thinking about that question. So then we'll go into our seventh question, and again we've got 10 total, particularly surrounding the Olympics itself here. Should athletes be allowed to openly protest political issues during the games, even if it violates the IOC's neutrality rules?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm terribly familiar with the International Olympic Committee's neutrality rules. I see whereas the neutrality rules would be beneficial in order to do peace, in order to get on with the games. But in many cases, in the case this is, of course, coming from an American perspective, of course, with the idea of freedom of speech and different things of that, would probably favor sort of just the capacity if that's something if there's a need to protest something. Can't imagine what that would be um, at the Olympics, though. I suppose there could be something. I reckon that would probably, in my view, be more significant. IOC neutrality rules. It's not that they're for nothing, but generally, I would say they would seem to err on the side of overreach. Is sort of what it sounds like. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, can't say that I know a lot about the rules either, but I would say that they should be able to openly protest as long as it doesn't interfere with the games themselves,
Right, right. As
would be
long as
kind
it's
of
nothing
my stance
violent,
on that.
again, as long as it doesn't descend to anarchy, as we were talking about earlier, as long as there are crazy protests or burning down the stadiums, then that might be a bit too far. So
Yeah, I would say so. And so that'll take us into our eighth question. Is it time to remove sports with low global participation from the Winter Olympics? I'm going to say yes, because it gives a disadvantage to countries that don't have participants participating when it comes to the scoring.
that makes sense. And again, this is another one. I know that I say this repeatedly, may sound like a broken record, but we don't have a great deal of context on this. So it would be interesting to know exactly by what margins, how few people are competing in this, because this is, of course, is a big event considerably, even though it's very selective. Of course, the athletes, the best of the best, are Olympians. But it would be interesting to see just how sparse the competition is in some of the events, and maybe setting a certain threshold on that would be worthwhile. Say this is the minimum amount of people we can take in this event and still do it would be worthwhile in terms of that. But I'd probably tend to err on that side, as unfortunate as it may be to see some of these interesting, obscure sports go away. It might just benefit the overall Olympic Games in order to, in order for again that wider participation in the games. Some of those requirements were loosen up, as it were, on some of these smaller events.
Yeah, and I will say if I highlighted the word low, because again, the word low is not really specific, and
Right? It's
so
it's pretty vague. Exactly how low
it
are we
is.
talking? Are that two people in the event or what?
Yeah, so I think it almost depends in this situation, but by my definition of what the word low is, I would say yes, it's probably time to remove those sports. Or one option is they're done not necessarily for scoring, but they're done more for just participation, for fun. But so that would kind of be my argument with that. And so kind of a solution to that. Well, that brings us into question number 9. Should the Olympics require host cities to use only existing venues to reduce environmental and financial waste? I have to say I have kind of a strong opinion about this. My answer is yes. And only if there's no existing venues that are available to support the sports that are needed. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is a bit of would you call it a catch-all? Because that would be great if these giant Olympic stadiums were already available and they were just there, set up for the Olympic Games, but that generally isn't the case. There's generally a reason
Yeah.
why we need to construct new stadiums for the Olympic Games, because that's not something that we use often. This is a major global event. Ton of people from all over the world come here. That requires a lot in accommodations, and that's not something that's going to maintained throughout the year. Of course, in certain cases with those facilities, it is nice to have hindsight, but in many cases, it's just so costly to maintain them that it isn't necessarily practical. So certainly it does have that influence, but I don't know that it would be any more practical in a way in terms of waste. It may be wasteful to take these facilities and rather just having, of course, what's often done now for the Olympic Games, to my understanding, is we have these major stadiums, major facilities constructed to accommodate the Olympic Games. For that purpose, they meet the specific accommodations, and then afterwards, it's not something that's necessarily maintained. In many cases, it might even be torn down, because just on this great scale, in terms of waste, it would arguably be more waste in order to just maintain these giant facilities made to accommodate people from all across the world, all these major sporting events, and just the expense of maintaining that, paying the utilities and everything year round. It would seem to be a lot more waste for something that you do every few years.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I will say about it is that a lot of the host cities most likely already have venues that could be used. And if they needed to add another venue, I feel like they could do that, but they don't necessarily need to create all new venues just for the Olympics.
Sure, that's fair. That's fair.
So I think again, it's one of those where it would almost depend on the situation. So it could vary by situation. So
Naturally, my thought is that generally it isn't the case. Doesn't sound all that practical. There's probably a reason why we've been doing it this way for so long, but I may be entirely wrong. And again, if you have any insight on that, you're certainly welcome to prove us wrong. Just put your information in the comments down below. We may even have you on a future episode of the podcast. Okay.
yes, and again, something that is brand new, we are just now starting that as of this very episode. You can now call a number in with your questions. Again, we've just now started doing this today. You can call using our Google Voice phone number for GWP Media. You can contact us at 417-448-0819. Again, that is 417-448-0819. Brand new line that we are using here on GWP Media that you can call us in with.
Absolutely. So, again, call that number, any insight, any input, things you would like to hear. Give us a ring.
All right, and then we have the 10th and final question. Is the IOC doing enough to ensure gender equality in events, representation, and media coverage for the 2026 Games? Now, because we are running a little bit short on time, we actually would like to hear what you have to say with this particular question. So if you'd like to call in with a response or put in the comments below on this video, you can go ahead and do so at this time with your response to this 10th and final question. And then we've got three bonus questions that are related specifically to Russia competing in this year's Olympics, with, of course, its ongoing war with Ukraine. We'll start with that first question here. Should Russia be allowed to compete in the 2026 Winter Olympics while the war in Ukraine is ongoing, or should geopolitical conflicts automatically disqualify a nation from participation? My initial thoughts are that countries have been banned before with good reason when they've been at war with other countries. This has already been done in the past. I feel like that the answer is probably yes, unfortunately. I really hate that for the Russian athletes who haven't necessarily done anything to necessarily participate in this war. You know, it's not necessarily to say that they're responsible for the war, the athletes themselves. And I'm sure that there are athletes that maybe don't necessarily support the war or wish that it weren't happening or feel like that they're now having to pay for something that's not their fault. And so I'm sure that there are Russian athletes who do believe that, whether or not they support the war or not. I'm sure that that varies by individual person just based on a person's beliefs. They're in the country of Russia. It's unfortunate that Russian athletes do have to potentially take the penalty for something like that. But I feel like as other nations, sometimes we have to come together and almost put, if you want to say, a sanction in order to prevent ongoing wars or conflicts or something like this from happening in the future. Sort of put some sort of incentive for countries to not go to war.
Sure, that's a good point. And naturally, of course, this particular conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it's been going on for some time. Again, if you're not up to date with that, we've been following it extensively, of course, covering it throughout the year on the Great World podcast, and certainly for more current information, kind of on the news side of things. Of course, check out our information on GWP News, all of that, and more here. So, some great information you want to check out if you haven't already on that front. Now, in terms of the central question here, should Russia be allowed to compete in the 2026 Winter Olympics while the war in Ukraine is ongoing, or should geopolitical conflicts automatically disqualify a nation from participation? Okay, looks like the ultimate question is kind of the final question here. Should geopolitical conflict automatically disqualify from participation? That is a very broad question. So my answer to that would be no. Don't think any and all geopolitical conflicts automatically should automatically disqualify a nation from participation in the Olympic Games if they're able to work past that and still participate. Of course, throughout history, the Olympic Games have been a major source thing for countries to come together and perhaps as a result, after leading up to it, find peace. Um, Certainly a benefit on that front. So I would say, unless there is a reasonable amount of a high degree of security concern here, certainly in the case of Russia and Ukraine, just this ongoing, again, wide reaching war. Certainly, this would seem to be a more serious one. Certainly, an exception. Certainly, one of the few in the past few rounds of the Olympics Games that we've seen that has actually come into question. And naturally, so what we've seen in the past, returning to kind of the first part of the question, should Russia be allowed to compete in the 2026 Winter Olympics? I'd probably be with you on that, Jay, kind of in light of what happened. That's a pretty serious thing um, in terms
Well,
of kind of Russia's actions on the front of course, Putin wanting to expand. And if you listen to him at all, it seems that he has some nostalgia for the bygone days of the Soviet Union and would very much like to expand that, which certainly doesn't seem to be in the best interest, certainly not of our country, um, of America, or really of the Western world. That's just a different kind of society. Values aren't really aligned all that well with ours, so it makes sense why we wouldn't allow them to participate from a practical standpoint. But again, in the past Olympic Games, what we've seen, I believe the last ones, well, Russians were still able to compete in the Olympic Games, just not as Russia, just not under their own flag, under their own country. The flag they actually competed under was the Olympic flag, or the International Olympic Committee flag, that also incorporated the Russian flag. In other words, it wasn't the Russian flag, it was the flag for the Russian delegation. So, to be quite frank, Jake, this question seems somewhat trivial. It seems that in any case, we will have Russian athletes participating, whether it's under the Russian flag or under the flag of the Russian delegation. And certainly, as you mentioned, for those athletes, many of them may not necessarily represent the views of the government uh, of their own country. So again, I suppose it's beneficial for them on that front. But then there always is the question of, is that compromising a great deal on our part, having them participate in the Olympic Games? There's been a lot of question about it, but from my standpoint, Jake, not really a whole lot changes between whether they're competing as Russia or whether they're competing as the Russian delegation. Perhaps a slight acknowledgement of the ongoing conflict, but not much more than that.
yeah, now the only thing I will say is the Winter and Summer Olympics have been put to a stop during wars in the past. So this wouldn't have been the
Right,
first time. And sometimes they have been
right. That has
completely even
happened
shut off
before.
altogether. So that is something to kind of keep in mind with that. And so that leads us into the 12th question here. Is it fair to punish Russian athletes, many of whom have no role in government decisions, by banning them from the games? Or is a full ban necessary to uphold Olympic values? We kind of already went over that question, so we'll go into the last question. Given Russia's history of state-sponsored um, doping scandals, this is interesting. Artificial intelligence at its finest, again, seeming to continue to bring this into question. And so, In fact, we'll just go ahead and end it there if it's gonna ask us another question about that. Um, but I
Absolutely.
think one thing to keep in mind before we leave here on this Winter Olympics special, the opening ceremony, of course, happening tonight. It's just really cool that we have this um, new sport that's being introduced into the Winter Olympics. The skimo or ski mountaineering is what it
Yes, very
officially is
cool.
called.
Very cool.
Yeah, I certainly think that that is a really good new sport that has been added. And in fact, what is that sound?
Oh my gosh, Jake. What the heck just happened?